Jeffrey Epstein's arrest in 2019 shocked the world. But for many investigators and journalists, the bigger shock wasn't what he was accused of. It was how long he had avoided serious consequences. Years before his final arrest, Epstein had already been investigated for similar crimes. Allegations surfaced as early as the early 2000s, with multiple victims coming forward to authorities. Despite the seriousness of the accusations, the case did not lead to a typical prosecution. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial agreement with federal prosecutors in Florida. Instead of facing federal charges that could have resulted in a life sentence, he pleaded guilty to lesser state charges. The deal allowed him to serve time in a county jail rather than a federal prison. Even more unusual were the conditions of his incarceration. Reports later revealed that Epstein was permitted extensive work release, allowing him to leave the facility for long periods during the day. Critics argued that the arrangement resembled a lenient detention rather than a traditional sentence. The agreement also included provisions that shielded potential co-conspirators from federal prosecution, a detail that would later become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Many victims said they were never informed that such a deal was being negotiated. After serving his sentence, Epstein returned to an extremely wealthy lifestyle. He continued to maintain residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and a private island in the Caribbean. Despite being a registered sex offender, he remained socially connected to influential figures across business, politics, and academia. Over the next decade, journalists and victims' advocates repeatedly attempted to bring renewed attention to the case. Civil lawsuits and investigative reporting continued to surface new details, raising questions about whether earlier decisions had prevented a broader examination of his activities. In 2018, a major investigative series revisited the original prosecution and the plea agreement. The reporting highlighted the unusual terms of the deal and reignited public scrutiny. Soon after, federal authorities reopened the investigation. When Epstein was arrested again in July 2019, prosecutors described evidence that suggested a far more extensive pattern of alleged conduct than had previously been addressed in court. For many observers, the arrest raised an unsettling possibility that earlier actions had allowed the situation to continue for years. Legal experts noted that plea agreements are a routine part of the justice system, but the scope of Epstein's deal, particularly the protections for unnamed associates, stood out as highly unusual. Critics argued that the arrangement prevented a full accounting of what had happened. Victims who had spent years seeking justice expressed frustration that earlier proceedings had not provided them the opportunity to tell their stories in open court. Some said the renewed investigation felt like a chance to finally be heard. At the same time, the case highlighted broader questions about how wealth, legal representation, and influence can affect outcomes within the justice system. Epstein had assembled a team of high-profile attorneys and consultants, and the legal battle surrounding him spanned multiple jurisdictions. As details continued to emerge, public interest intensified. The case was no longer just about one individual. It had become a symbol of perceived inequality and unanswered questions. When Epstein died in custody before trial, those questions became even more difficult to resolve. Without a full courtroom proceeding, much of the evidence and testimony that might have clarified the extent of his activities was never presented publicly. Today, years later, the case remains a subject of investigation, litigation, and debate. Civil lawsuits involving associates and institutions continue, but many observers believe the full story may never be completely known. For victims and advocates, the central issue has never been only about one man, but about accountability and whether systemic failures allowed harm to continue longer than it should have. The Epstein case ultimately raises a troubling question, not just how one individual operated, but how a series of decisions, agreements, and circumstances allowed the situation to persist for so many years before finally coming to a head. And for many people, that question still doesn't have a satisfying answer.